Nobody in that convoy expected to be parked sideways across a gravel cut by 10 in the morning, engines idling, going nowhere. 11 loaded haul trucks, 4 pickups, and 1 bulldozer's worth of permits had been queued up since 6 that morning to roll down through Coburn Gap and start moving dirt on the first day of active construction. Drivers leaned against their fenders smoking, radios crackling back and forth with nobody quite sure who was supposed to give the order to do anything different than what they'd already been told to do. They were considerably less confident about all of it by the time a man with one leg, sitting in a lawn chair dragged out to the middle of the road, finished reading them a single sentence out of a deed book from 1962. Dale Coburn had been expecting them for about 3 weeks. Caldera Mining Company had not been expecting him at all, and by noon that day the silence coming out of their site office was the kind of silence that costs a company several $100,000 before lunch. There's something about a person who doesn't have to prove anything. If you know what I mean, you'll know why this story is worth your time. Hit subscribe and stay with us. Boone County, West Virginia, sits in coal country the way some places sit in farm country, the land itself shaped by a century and a half of men deciding what was underneath it mattered more than what was on top of it. Dale Coburn's 80 acres sat at the bottom of a narrow hollow the locals called Coburn Gap, named for his family 3 generations before him, hemmed in on 3 sides by ridges too steep to build on, and bordered on the 4th by the only stretch of low, gradable ground for nearly 2 miles in either direction. He ran a small herd of beef cattle, kept a half-acre garden his late wife had started before she passed in 2019, breast cancer that nobody caught early enough to do much about, and lived alone except for a black Labrador named Scout, who'd come home with him from his second deployment in everything but paperwork. He still planted the garden every spring in roughly the same rows she had, not because the soil demanded it, but because he'd never found a good reason to change something she'd gotten right the first time. He still drove the same Ford F-250 he'd bought used the year he got back from his first tour. The clutch modified years ago by a shop in Charleston to work with the prosthetic, and most mornings he was up and feeding cattle before the fog had cleared off the ridge above the house. Caldera Mining Company started buying up the ridges around him in the spring of 2022, eventually assembling just over 10,000 acres across 3 adjoining hollows for a surface mining operation, the company's own permit filings, valued at something north of $340 million over the life of the project. They bought out 11 of Dale's neighbors over 18 months. Fair prices by most accounts. Nothing underhanded about any of it. By that September, the company had 2 Caterpillar dozers and a fleet of Peterbilt haul trucks staged at a contractor's yard outside Madison, waiting on nothing but a clear route down through the 1 gap wide and level enough to carry them. The only ground they didn't own, when construction was set to begin that September, was Dale Coburn's 80 acres sitting square in the middle of it. The 11 neighbors who'd already sold watched the standoff from a distance with mixed feelings, most of them having taken Caldera's first offer without much negotiation, glad for the money but not entirely sure. Watching it play out, whether they'd left something on the table by not reading their own paperwork quite as closely as Dale had read his. A few of them stopped by that fall just to see the lawn chair spot for themselves, the gravel still showing tire ruts from where 11 trucks had idled in place for 6 hours. Nobody begrudged him the outcome. Most of them said, if asked, that they were glad somebody in that valley had finally made the company slow down and read something twice. A company land agent named Curtis Boggs drove out to the farm in June of that year with an offer of $340,000 for the whole property, more than double what the county assessor had it valued at, and seemed genuinely surprised when Dale turned it down without much discussion. Offers fair, Mr. Coburn, Boggs said, standing in the yard with a folder of comps under his arm. Better than fair, way I see it. Dale told him the land wasn't for sale, plain as that, and didn't offer much more explanation than the weather report would have. Boggs wasn't a cruel man, and he didn't act like one. He'd closed deals with 11 other families in that same valley without much trouble, and he had no particular reason to think the 12th would go any differently. He came back twice more that summer, raised the offer to $410,000 the second time, mentioned almost as an aside that the company could always look at running the haul road around the long way if it came to that, and left both times with the same flat no, delivered without anger. The way a man declines a refill on coffee he's already decided he doesn't want. The third visit, Boggs brought a folder of satellite photos showing the alternate route he'd mentioned, a winding 7-mile detour around the back of the ridge that would have added, by his own engineer's estimate, nearly $9 million to the project's hauling costs over its lifetime. He left that folder on the porch rail when Dale didn't invite him in to discuss it. Not stubborn, exactly, just a man who'd already done his own math on what 80 acres and 40 years of quiet were worth to him, and hadn't found a number on Boggs's offer sheet that came close to matching it. What Boggs and the engineers behind him hadn't done in 18 months of buying up that valley was pull the full chain of title on the access road running through the bottom of Coburn Gap. The road itself wasn't really a road in any formal sense. It was a gravel cut Dale's grandfather, Ellis Coburn, had granted as a limited right of way back in 1962. Recorded at the county courthouse in a deed book, nobody at Caldera had any particular reason to open, since the company's surveyors had simply assumed a road that old, used continuously for 60 years, carried whatever access rights a modern mining operation would need. Dale found the deed himself. The same week, Boggs made his second offer, going through a metal filing box his grandfather had kept in the attic since before Dale was born. The box smelled like the rest of the attic always had, dust and cedar and the faint mildew of paper that had survived a few too many humid summers without quite ruffling, and Dale went through it the way Ellis had taught him to go through any stack of paperwork, slow, page by page. Nothing skimmed. A neighbor down the road, Curtis Wills, who had nothing whatsoever to do with any of what followed, but had helped Dale haul hay off that same bottomland every July for going on a decade, happened to be in the kitchen that evening returning a borrowed post hole digger, and would later tell people he remembered Dale coming downstairs that night, looking like he'd found something, though at the time neither of them had any idea what it was going to mean. Ellis Coburn had granted that 1962 right-of-way to a small logging outfit working timber 2 ridges over, and he'd written the restriction into the deed himself, in his own hand, after watching an earlier outfit run heavy trucks through the gap a decade before and tear the bottomland up bad enough that it took years to recover. The recorded language was plain enough that even a county clerk reading it cold understood it in under a minute. Right-of-way granted for agricultural, silvicultural, and residential use only, vehicles not to exceed 10,000 pounds gross weight, any other use requiring written consent of the grantor or his heirs. A loaded coal haul truck, the kind Caldera intended to run through that gap dozens of times a day for the better part of a decade, weighs somewhere between 70 and 80,000 pounds. Not close, not even in the same conversation as 10,000 pounds, and Ellis Coburn, dead 11 years by the time any of this mattered, had written that number into a deed 60 years earlier, without any way of knowing it would someday be the only thing standing between a mining company and 10,000 acres it had already spent a fortune acquiring. It was, Patricia Knotts told Dale on the phone the day she confirmed it, a little like a company buying a house, assuming the driveway easement next door let them park an 18-wheeler on it, only to find out the actual paper said bicycles and lawn mowers. Nobody usually bothers checking, because nobody usually needs to. Caldera needed to, and hadn't, for the better part of 2 years. Ellis raised Dale's father, and, after a car accident took both of Dale's parents in 1998, raised Dale too, The two of them alone on that same 80 acres through most of Dale's childhood. Ellis never talked much about the 1962 logging trouble unless somebody asked directly, and even then he kept it short. A company had come through, promising to leave the ground the way they found it, and hadn't. And a man learned from that the way a man learns from getting burned, by not putting his hand back on the stove a second time without checking it first. He made Dale read every page of every document that came through that farm, from the time the boy was old enough to understand what a sentence meant. Not because he expected trouble, he said, but because trouble never announced itself in advance, and a man who hadn't read his own paperwork had nobody to blame but himself when it caught him out. Paperwork don't lie, Ellis used to say, dropping the article the way he did most mornings before his second cup of coffee. People lie. Paperwork just sits there and waits on somebody honest enough to read it. Dale enlisted in the Army in 2003, partly to get off that ridge for a while, and partly because two of his cousins had already gone and made it sound like the only sensible thing a young man from Boone County did at 18. He did 2 tours, the first quiet enough, the second considerably less so, and lost his left leg below the knee to an Eid outside Kandahar in March of 2011. Along with a traumatic brain injury that still gave him migraines bad enough, on certain days, to put him flat in a dark room for hours at a stretch. He spent the better part of a year at Walter Reed and another 6 months in outpatient rehab before he came home to Boone County in 2012, moved back in with Ellis, and took the farm over fully when his grandfather died in 2013. 3 weeks shy of what would have been his 91st birthday. He still keeps the prosthetic leg the VA fitted him with leaned against the same kitchen chair every night, the way some men keep their boots by the door, and he still gets migraines bad enough most months that loud, sustained vibration, the kind of line of loaded coal trucks running past his front porch all day, would produce without fail. Was never going to be something he could simply learn to live around. He drove the deed book copy down to a title researcher in Madison the following week, a woman named Patricia Knotts, who'd spent 30 years pulling chains of title for lawyers and landmen across 3 counties, and asked her to confirm what he thought he was reading. She spent 2 days running the full chain back through every recorded instrument touching that 14-acre strip, checking for any later modification, release, or court order that might have widened the original grant. The kind of careful, unglamorous work that rarely gets mentioned in how a story like this gets told later, but is most of what actually decides it. She confirmed it inside the week. The restriction had never been modified, released, or superseded by anything else in the chain of title. Whatever Caldera believed it owned the rights to, the actual recorded document said something considerably narrower, and had said so since before most of the company's own engineers were born. Construction start day arrived on a Tuesday in September. The convoy queued up at the mouth of the gap before sunup, 11 loaded haul trucks idling in a line behind a pilot pickup, everybody on site fully expecting to be moving dirt by mid-morning. Dale was waiting for them at the bottom, a lawn chair set up dead center in the gravel, Scout lying in the shade of the porch 40 yards back, and a manila folder on his lap holding a certified copy of the 1962 deed. A letter from Patricia Knotts confirming the chain of title, and a temporary restraining order his lawyer had walked into the Boone County courthouse and gotten signed the previous afternoon. The pilot driver got out first, looked at the chair, looked at the folder, and radioed back to the site office. Nobody behind him moved. Nobody shut an engine off. Nobody seemed entirely sure whether the next move belonged to them or to the man in the lawn chair. Curtis Boggs arrived 20 minutes later, and to his credit, he didn't raise his voice or threaten anything. He just stood there a while, reading the restraining order twice, and then the deed language a third time, doing the same arithmetic in his head that Patricia Knotts had already done out loud. 80,000 pounds against a hard limit of 10,000, with nothing in 60 years of recorded paperwork that said otherwise. "This isn't going to hold up," Boggs said, not entirely convinced of his own sentence by the time he'd finished saying it. "Might not," Dale said. "Court can sort that out. Until it does, I'd appreciate it if your truck stayed put." He didn't raise his voice either. He didn't need to. 11 trucks and a pilot car sat idling in that gap for the better part of 6 hours that day, burning fuel and driver time at a cost Caldera's own later filings put at $46,000, before the site superintendent finally called it and sent the convoy back the way it came. The restraining order held through a hearing 3 weeks later, a cramped courtroom in the Boone County Courthouse with more Caldera lawyers in attendance than there were spectator seats to hold them. 3 of them flown in from a firm in Charleston that billed by the hour and argued, at some length, that 60 years of continuous use had effectively expanded the easement's scope, regardless of what the original document said. The judge wasn't moved by that argument, not even a little. She read the 1962 language into the record herself, slow, and asked Caldera's lead attorney directly whether anything in the company's own files showed the restriction had ever been formally modified. He admitted, after a pause that ran a few seconds longer than comfortable, that it hadn't. The order held again on appeal the following spring, the appellate panel finding the language plain enough on its face that there wasn't much room to argue around it. With no other gradable route through that stretch of ridge, the company's entire 10,000-acre permit sat frozen for the better part of 8 months, costing, by most local estimates, somewhere over $4 million in idle equipment, delayed permits, and a renegotiated construction schedule nobody at the company had budgeted for going in. $4 million working out to something close to $16,000 a day, every day, for the better part of 8 months, against a settlement that would eventually run them roughly 1/10 of that. Somebody on Caldera's board reportedly asked, during a quarterly call investors later got a partial transcript of, how exactly the company had spent 2 years and tens of millions of dollars assembling 10,000 acres without anybody confirming the one road in or out of it. Nobody on the call had a satisfying answer for him. Caldera came back to the table that winter with an offer considerably different from the one Curtis Boggs had carried out to the farm the previous June. Dale didn't sell the land. He granted a permanent industrial right-of-way easement across a 14-acre strip at the bottom of the gap, on terms his own lawyer negotiated over 4 months. For $1, $2 million up front, plus an ongoing per-ton royalty on everything hauled through it, along with binding noise and vibration limits during the hours his migraines were worst, and a company-funded sound barrier along the stretch nearest his house. He kept the other 66 acres, the cattle, the garden, and Scout. Asked once by a reporter from the Charleston paper who drove out wanting a quote for a story on the settlement, whether he'd known from the start his grandfather's deed would hold up in court, Dale told her he honestly hadn't. He'd believed it was right. Believing it and knowing a judge would agree with him were 2 different things, and he said as much, plain, without trying to dress the answer up into something more certain than it had actually felt at the time. Dale Coburn is 41 this year. He still runs cattle on the home place, still keeps his grandfather's filing box in the same spot in the attic, and has added a few folders of his own to it since. He doesn't think of himself as having beaten a mining company. Not exactly. He says, if you ask him straight, that his grandfather beat them in 1962 and just hadn't gotten around to collecting on it yet. The royalty checks come quarterly now, and most months he doesn't bother opening them the day they arrive. The way a man doesn't rush to open mail he already knows isn't going to change much about how he spends his Tuesday. He used some of the upfront money to finish modifying the house for the leg, a ramp at the back door he'd been putting off for years, and a roll-in shower the VA had recommended twice, without him ever quite getting around to it. and put most of the rest away without much fanfare. Curtis Boggs still works for Caldera, still buys land across 3 counties, and reads every recorded easement himself now, twice before any offer goes out, a habit his supervisors credit, somewhat to his own private amusement, to a one-legged veteran and a lawn chair. He's said to more than one colleague since that he doesn't hold any of it against Dale Coburn personally. A man doing his own job carefully isn't a grudge worth carrying. He's also said, quieter, usually after a second beer, that he wishes somebody had taught him that lesson with something smaller than $4 million attached to it. Ellis Coburn wrote one careful sentence into a deed book 60 years before anybody needed it, and never lived to see what it was worth. He didn't write it expecting a payoff. He wrote it because a company had wronged him once, and he didn't intend to leave the door open for it to happen again, to him or to whoever came after him on that ground. Some men leave their grandchildren land. Some men leave them a sentence, written plain enough that nobody, 60 years on, could argue their way around it.